we should all be proud to have Pete Hamill back in Brooklyn. I wrote a story for the Times last fall about Pete's return, and I pointed out that about a week before Pete was born, Thomas Wolfe wrote his famous line, "Only the dead know Brooklyn." Well, obviously he was wrong about that. And somewhere after that, in fact, posthumously, he wrote that you can't go home again. Well, Pete has disproved that, obviously. He lived in Manhattan for decades, but he now has gone home again. He and his wife, Yukiko, moved back here from their Tribeca loft. They moved to Prospect Heights, a neighborhood that probably wasn't called Prospect Heights when he lived here. And when he lived here, it probably wasn't called the South Slope either. But, you know, things have changed. He moved back to what he called the old country, the Democratic Republic of Brooklyn. And it's a different Brooklyn than the one he left. But Pete, tell us, why did you move back?
A part of it was a longing for a more human scale than was developing in Manhattan. I lived in Manhattan with my wife for 30 years, and we lost the sky. We couldn't find a cloud anywhere that was moving. Air rights were the thing, where these super tall buildings replaced a stroll on a Saturday morning to go to the Carnegie Deli and then hope that we could get home alive. And it was a longing at first, but it's a longing that's so primitive and so traditional to human beings. The Odyssey is not about fighting all these guys all over the place. It's about getting home to Penelope. It's about being home in the home place. And I thought if I could do that, it would be a fitting way to end a long and what's been amazingly good life. Among people who I understand. You know, even those who arrived a week and a half earlier. You know. I also was conscious of age. I was 81 when I decided to do this, which is absurd.
Absurd that you are 81?
Yeah, absurd. That itself is a miracle, given my youth. But I had also, at one point, bought a burial plot at Greenwood Cemetery. And I got it right next to Boss Tweed. You could look it up. The reason being that if you're going to spend eternity with somebody, more fun with a scoundrel than a saint. You know, people Breslin must be going crazy right now with all these saints all over the place.
Must be.
You know? So that happened at more or less the same time. And I think it's a sort of natural impulse as old as the Greeks and Romans to find your way back to the home place. I think it's there. One of my favorite books is Cicero on old age. It's just an amazing book with a sense of humor and laughter, you know, that you can be old and not be entirely a joke if you think of yourself in the world in the best way, possible way. I remember when Robert Kennedy got shot and killed. And I went into a downer. I had a downer afterwards. I went off with my kids and went to Mexico to heal for a while and finally got home to New York a couple of months after the killing. And I had lunch with Paul O'Dwyer, who is my counselor on all things moral and otherwise. And he says, "Well, what are you up to?" I said, "Nothing, Paul. I got like a writer's block, I think." And he looked at me like, "Writer's block?" He says, "For Christ's sakes, you're not important enough to have a writer's block." And I laughed out loud. It's at Second Avenue Deli, the font of all human knowledge on Second Avenue, when it was on Second Avenue. But the notion that you're not important enough to have a writer's block, I laughed out loud and haven't stopped writing since. So you learn from what can be some of the awful things. What happened to Bob Kennedy was one of them. But it wasn't like the film on Syria 3 days ago. I think there's a particular Brooklyn attitude, I think, that goes back to when I was a kid, that's still around. And it's a kind of a form of irony combined from the great gift of the Jews to the Irish, is to develop irony of some kind, not to weep. And you think of your parents, and I was lucky I had these parents who worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and then worked some more. And they never made a speech to me. They never once said, my father, for example, who had lost a leg above the knee on the left leg, playing soccer in the year before penicillin, when you had to wait a long time at Kings County Hospital. He'd have had 2 legs, except for timing. He couldn't cash in on what the Irish did own, which was construction work and the waterfront, and particularly in Manhattan. He never complained. Self-pity was not permissible. It was the unacceptable sin. And I remember one night clearly, I was thinking of it today, Sam, coming here. It was an August day, I was 13. And I was the oldest of what was a family of 7 kids, of all the children of immigrants, the whole bunch of us. a noisy, rowdy pack of mostly boys. And I remembered one night living at 378 7th Avenue, which was one of those tenements that had hot water but no heat. So I was doing dishes as often as I could. And I thought of that one night. It was August, clearly. And I woke up from my father groaning in a kind of alto saxophone sound. It was like, pain. And it was because the stump of his leg was blistered from the place that he worked in that had no air conditioning. My mother heard him and woke up and got chopping ice out of the refrigerator, the ice box actually, and putting it in towels and cooling it off. And I thought in the morning when he got up and went to work again that I can't ever disgrace these people. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it. I haven't led a flawless life, but it's nothing that would have appalled them. The closest I came to being someone who hurt them was I hurt my mother by dropping out of high school and going to work in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. You know, I went to Regis, a Jesuit school, and still there on 86th Street, 85th Street. And it was an extraordinary school because, again, the irony we were picking up in the street was matched by the kind of Jesuitical irony, which is a little more brutal, you know, without the relief of, and yet it made me see the world better, that I had a chance and I blew it. And I'd had to play catch-up ball for the rest of my life. And I'm still doing it. I am still, you know, pick up Cicero and laugh at a guy who's been dead since 32 AD. And I think if my writing has anything to convey, it's about all the lessons that are not taught in school, but are learned in life from the people who were lucky enough to spend life with. I'm blathering too much, forgive me.
No, hardly at all. I think I may leave, though. You don't need me here. You said that it's not the same Brooklyn you grew up in, but it's Brooklyn. But it's not the Brooklyn of Jews and Irish, and yet organically it's still the same Brooklyn that you're talking about. Why has that Brooklyn been maintained? What is it about? I mean, I don't want to offend anyone here, but it's not the same in Queens or the Bronx or Staten Island. What is it about Brooklyn?
I think there's a number of things. One is that at the heart of Brooklyn is a park. I mean, the most beautiful park. You know, it makes Central Park look like a bad idea. You know, the same designers, but they got it right in Brooklyn. And Prospect Park also taught me, who was impoverished if you could go to Prospect Park? Who was impoverished? I was Bumba the Jungle Boy, for God's sakes, running around in the Quaker graveyard on Lookout Mountain, which was a hill, but felt like a mountain when you were 10 years old. So I think it's that. Plus, I think it had the sea. Coney Island is a part of Brooklyn. Sheepshead Bay is part of Brooklyn. Don't ask me why South Brooklyn is called South Brooklyn if it's in the north of Brooklyn. All I can figure is that Junior Persico flunked geography on his way to Leavenworth. But because it had built into it certain streets like Eastern Parkway, doesn't allow commercial. The original development and use of monies, complicated monies, forbade commercial enterprises to fill the streets. So the stores and shops and everything are a block behind it somewhere. And the avenue is still what it was when the place opened.
It was so funny when you told me about not seeing the sky and not seeing the sun and not seeing the clouds. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was afterward struck by the fact that a Manhattanite wouldn't have noticed that because people in Manhattan don't look up. But you clearly were betraying yourself as a Brooklyn boy, because that was something you noticed and missed. Because in Brooklyn, as you said, Brooklyn is a horizontal city, not like the vertical city of Manhattan.
That's the key to it. Yeah, that's the key. And to some extent, Queens and parts of the Bronx are like that too. But if you grew up in a place, you have a different thing in your genes. You know when places were normal and when they were abnormal. For example, you mentioned Jack Roosevelt Robinson before. I mean, not only was he a great baseball player, he was probably the best educated player in the major leagues at the time. He'd gone to universities in California. And I happened to be at a game at Ebbets Field in 1947 that my father's friends took me. And I could see they were playing Pittsburgh, and Hank Greenberg was playing first base for the opposition. And I could see Robinson and Greenberg talking. You couldn't hear the words. So years later, I ran into Greenberg at some event. And I said, "Do you remember a game in 1947 at Ebbets Field?" And I said, "You and Robinson, what were you talking about?" He said, "Well, what happened was Robinson got hit by a pitch went to first base, and I said to him, "Don't worry about it, kid. They did the same crap to me." And he stole second and scored on a single. And he didn't have to make a point that would get Branch Rickey upset. He didn't have to make a sense. The whole thing was right in that little story that he told me 15, 20 years later. So I think you're learning. One great thing about being a reporter is that you're learning something new all the time. And I was blessed because a lot of really good editors, out of pity and compassion, began to help me. And I think the one line that Paul Sand said to me, my editor at the Post, years ago, it strikes me now as something very relevant. I said, Paul, I'm sitting in the office on Sunday, and the phone's ringing, and I keep getting stories like, I know that Nixon has a boyfriend named Irving, or something. And Paul gave me the best piece of journalistic advice I ever got. He said, listen, if you want it to be true, it usually isn't. And that's true in life as well as in journalism.
I'm afraid so. So my favorite is when I got a letter, with marked in block letters, of course, and you open it up and it said, there is no gold in Fort Knox. The same kind of, it's probably from the same person. You said that this city is obviously wealthier and healthier than it was when you were young, but there are also problems of race relations, to some extent of public safety, of schools that maybe weren't as obvious back then as they are now. On the other hand, you said gentrification is still better than junkies. So how do you reconcile the improvements in the city and the fact that some things, for some people certainly, are not better?
I think clearly you can't reconcile them. We can't go around talking about how perfect we are as a nation when opioids are really, eating the brains out of kids all over the country, all over the place. And that was what I meant, because I saw what happened when heroin came. Suddenly in Prospect Park, there'd be kids dead in the bushes, or in the backyard off a roof where they'd been, heaved at some point. So anybody that thought the good old days included heroin is count me out. I saw what it did to families, what people did. People robbed their mothers to get the drugs. And I don't think you can reconcile it. I'm not a big fan of legalized pot and all that, only because I saw where, in many ways, it led. To kids that were otherwise decent kids. And as usual in life, the worst wounds are self-inflicted.
So why do we think the good old days were so good? You said nostalgia maintains its grip on the imagination and is still the ruling passion after greed, anger, and resistance to authority.
That's true. I think New York in particular, the dominant emotion is nostalgia. For several reasons. One, we all come from people who started out somewhere else. You know, they started out in Sicily, or Sligo, or Spain, or you know, and came and left behind people they loved, and left behind landscapes they loved, and weather that they loved, and came here where it was not so simple. And at the same time, the speed of change in New York adds to the nostalgia. You go away for the summer and you come back and your favorite coffee shop is gone forever. It doesn't come back as a Protestant church. It comes back only in memory. And memory is a highlight film. Memory is very selective. I hate the phrase the American dream, because dreams are not willed. You can't lie down at night and say, I want to dream about Jane Russell. You know, you can't do that. It doesn't work that way. The American vision is really what I would rather see used. And the notion that we're constantly dealing with in the last couple of years, the notion of America first among people who are living in a hemisphere that's all America, from the top of Canada all the way to the bottom of Patagonia, all Americans. You know, thinking that the United States has a monopoly on being an American is absurd. You know, Trump and some of these other guys think that we're the victim of Mexico, you know, which has, you know, which lost 7 states to the forces of manifest destiny. It's just absurd sometimes. But I am not a believer in vehement anger either. Yes, the thing is wrong, what's going on with, say, Mexico. Correct it. You know, tell the true history. Tell the real history of what happened in 1846. Tell that story. But crazy anger and violence doesn't get us anywhere.
Let me ask you about that, and combining that with writing, and then I want to open the floor to questions from you, if I may. One of the things that has struck me as a reporter here and covering New York is the lack of local news coverage, the decline in local news coverage, the vacuum, the abandonment in local news coverage by the print media, including, I'm sorry to say, the New York Times, by TV, by radio. And I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, that what is being covered on the web, some of which is very good, is making up for it for various reasons, at least not yet. What worries me is, first of all, that coverage isn't there. But secondly, what worries me is, does anybody care anymore? When we were at the Daily News together, we cared about covering the news. We cared about getting people to know what was going on, perhaps influencing their opinion, getting them galvanized into doing something about some injustice. I don't know if people care anymore. And, when you look at facts, do facts matter? I don't want to become totally cynical, but you wonder whether they do either. So when you're telling people what the truth is, does it matter anymore?
I want to believe it does. But the circulation of newspapers is so far down. I don't mean the Times, but...
But when Pete and I were at the Daily News, the circulation was over 2 million a day and 3 million on Sunday, and now it is below 200,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you say, well, they've got a lot more readers on the web now, that is true, but most of the readers on the web are from outside the metropolitan area.
I feel sorry for them. No, I remember when Murray Kempton won a Pulitzer Prize, and he was a great, great newspaper columnist. And I sent him a note, hats off, etc. And he said, he sent me a note back saying, you have to think of it as a triumph of the local. And it was. He's the only person I know who could have Stanley Steingart and Montaigne in the same sentence. He was unbelievable. But he could write about Sal Magley pitching, and he could write, he was, and it was important because the sense of the local helped explain the city to new arrivals and explained new arrivals to the new arrivals what the city really was like. So the city, the people who lived in the city were as much the subject matter. You'd think when Breslin died a week ago, Jimmy Breslin, old friend, it was like 30,000 people left the room, and that was when he was drinking, which is he hadn't for a long time. But I think that ability to say, you're driving down Queens Boulevard, here's what's really going on there, and be able to tell that in human terms that are understandable by people to whom Queens Boulevard is a mystery. And that means the people reading the paper or reading those pieces has a richer life. Mm-hmm. It's richer. We had some amazing, brilliant writers on newspapers, going all the way back to Damon Runyon and others, and O. Henry and so on, who wrote fiction and published it in newspapers, the way Alberto Moravia did in Italy, and Kafu Nagai in Japan, people like that. And the newspaper became a vivid touchstone to what the city is really like. And I don't feel that now the way I did when I was young.
And I don't think it's just us. I don't think it's just because we've gotten old.
Part of that, Sam, obviously comes from the arrival of Murdoch. You know, Murdoch, in the British tradition, was not about columns and so on. It didn't do that very much. And the people that did do it, like Orwell and others, really made a difference in British journalism. But we've lost it. And I wish I could convince the young to go out and do it this way. I saw something on television this morning where some journalism students had tracked down the principal of a school and found out she had one of those, you know, Lefty O'Doul kind of phony baloney credentials. And all I could think was, I wish I could hire these kids.
If we only had someplace to put them to work. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Let me turn the floor over to you, and please raise your hands and then give someone time to come over with a wireless mic so everybody can hear you. Any questions at all for Pete about New York, writing, or anything else? Yes, if we can turn up the lights a little so we can see people. Right over there, gentlemen.
Can you talk a little bit about your friendship with Jackie Onassis? How did that happen, and what was she like?
Next.
A fair answer. Next. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ann, and I grew up at 240 7th Avenue. In the top floor, my parents were immigrants as well, and I just want to say that you totally inspire me. And you wrote a beautiful column in 1987 about the AIDS crisis and the waste coming and what was happening in New York back then, and it just kind of stuck with me. But my question for you is, that's where I sort of learned about you, reading that column in the Post. My question for you is, what was your favorite part of growing up in an Irish household in Park Slope in the 40s?
The singing. My father, a typical Belfast male, was very careful about speaking. He could get killed in Belfast for saying the wrong thing. But he loved to sing. And a lot of the songs were comic. I had a hat when I came in, and I'll have a hat when I go out. You know, that kind of song. Or Paddy McGinty's Goat. He never sang Danny Boy. And the radio played a lot because my mother would be doing all kinds of work, like tending the rowdies that she had brought to the world. And so the music played all the time, the music of the standard American songbook, you know. I grew up with those songs. And then we began, when I was about 12 or 13, we'd stand around and make fun of the songs. For example, there was a song that Doris Day sang called It's Magic. You sigh, the song begins, you speak, and I hear violins. That's magic. And we made it. You sigh, your teeth fall out, your hair smells just like sauerkraut. It's tragic. So I was learning how to write, even though I didn't have a clue about what I was doing.
It's lucky you didn't become a lyricist.
But popular music was so important and powerful. In my case, when I began to really hear Sinatra, I understood how important he was, because it was urban music. It was the voice of 2 o'clock in the morning. And we knew people like that, or we were people like that. And he helped us to articulate some of the feelings that as young men we couldn't quite articulate. So it depends on the influences, you know. The other key thing to me was we lived 3 blocks from a library. The library at 9th Street and 6th Avenue, which was a Carnegie library, my favorite rich guy in the history of the world. He built these libraries with participation of the people that lived in the neighborhoods. He insisted that they were always going to be free, because when he was a kid in Pittsburgh, an immigrant from Scotland, he was turned away at the one library that was there. It was not a public library. He was turned away, and he never forgot it. And he ended up introducing me to these amazing people. So when I was 12, I sailed to Treasure Island. I escaped from the Chateau d'If with the Count of Monte Cristo. I even met this guy Bradbury, who took me to Mars. It was the wonderland of my life. And my mother saw it too. So she was a cashier in a movie house, the RKO at Prospect. And all the kids could get in free, obviously, okay. You know, that kind of thing. But they had to get a library card first. And so they had these riches beyond comprehension that came with it. You know, these books that were free. You could take them home and read them and bring them back and read them again. And that was like, I don't know what the library was in your neighborhood, Sam.
Church Avenue and Rockaway Parkway. But we used to go to Grand Army Plaza at least once a week.
Yeah. I remember going to Grand Army Plaza the first time. It was in 1941. The Dodgers had won the pennant. And my mother didn't know a bunt from a base hit. But she saw in the Brooklyn Eagle about the motorcade that was going to come past the library, which had just opened, the main library. She took us down there, and we sat there. I was 6, my brother Tom was 4. And we looked, and here came the limousines carrying the Dodgers to Ebbetsfield in triumph, you know. And I said, this is like history. It was like weird. It was so great. And I carried it around for a long time. And there was a thing on the library front door. It was carved into the facade. Here are enshrined the longing of great hearts. And I said, geez, what's a great heart? You know, maybe I can be a great heart. And, you know, walked all the way home, and I wanted to live in the library. I wanted to just take a corner somewhere and read Sherlock Holmes all day.
Well, now your legacy is in the library.
Yeah, they have they're putting together a Pete Hamill room.
Great.
You know. Thank you. With a lot of my own books, you know, I'll have to write some essay to explain why Bamba the Jungle Boy and Albert Camus are in the same library. So.
Okay.
Yes,
question?
Mr. Hamill. First of all, I'd like you to maybe talk about some of the Irish bars in Brooklyn, because Snooki's, I don't know if you ever went to Snooki's, but I really am so sorry that's closed. But before you do that, I'd like to share something with you. You mentioned our taking the 7 states from Mexico, and what a country this is. Santa Ana. I belong to the Society of Brooklynites, so I'm going to share this with you. Santa Ana was in charge of the Mexican army at the time, and they wiped out the Alamo. And then you had the Republic of Texas, da-da-da-da. But meanwhile, what happened to Santa Ana? He came up and he lived in Staten Island, and he had a lot of friends in Brooklyn. And a guy named Charles Adam talked to him, and Santa Ana said, hey, we chew this stuff, it's called chicle. So he opened up the Adams Chiclet factory, made a fortune, and Santa Ana went back to Mexico and became president. So what do you think of, this is a great country. So
Viva Santa Ana!
Yeah. So anyway, what do you think of the Irish bars, and do you think there's an effect on Brooklyn because so many are gone?
And a good effect or a bad effect?
I mean, it's been 40 years since I've had a beer. So, I learned a lot in bars, including the limits on my intelligence. But I don't have any longing for the life of the bars. I think there's much more to Irish history and Irish culture than throwing up on your shoes on St. Patrick's Day, you know? And so I worked very hard with Glucksman Ireland House. I'm on the board there to try to keep that particular part of Irish culture vividly alive. And also to say to the younger Irish Americans, the real stories are a lot better than the myths, you know? Read it. Just you mentioned Mexico. There was a whole bunch of Irishmen who went to Mexico with the American Army They weren't citizens. They had come over because of the famine and took jobs in the cavalry, and they defected. They thought, we're on the wrong side here. And they fought on the side of the Mexicans. They were called the San Patricios, the St. Patrick's Brigade. And there's been a couple of movies in Mexico about them. And so anytime you get arrested in Mexico, say, soy irlandés. I am Irish.
Let's take one more question, Bo.
I feel like people talk a lot about what's changed in Brooklyn, but now that you've moved back, other than the architecture, what else have you found has stayed the same as you remember?
The most important change probably is food. There are more good restaurants now all over the boroughs. The local papers cover the restaurants better than they cover certain other stories, but
That's because the restaurants put ads in.
I also think a lot of the young arrivals are filled with a sense of possibility in Brooklyn, that they can choose a goal, and through work and discipline and passion, find their way to what it is they want to be. And that's encouraging to me. I think we're going to get great art and great writers and so on out of that. We're already getting some of the writers. And for whatever reason, it seems possible in Brooklyn where it's too cramped in Manhattan these days for the young, you know, to go up and have 3 bad ideas and then finally get the 4th one right.
That's a good upbeat way to end. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Pete Hamill. Thanks.